Hello, I'm Anne-Marie MacDonald. Samuel de Champlain lived his life with his eyes on the horizon. He never wanted to be the second person to see what lay beyond it. We think we know him, the founder of this city, Quebec, a daring adventurer, meticulous mapmaker, and great explorer. In fact, his life is as much a mystery as this country was when he first landed. Was he a commoner with uncommon ambitions? Was he illegitimate royalty, or was he a spy? Whoever he was, Champlain was not the man we think we know. Montreal, 1849. An anti-government riot accidentally opens the door to the first mystery of Samuel de Champlain. The Parliament building in Montreal is torched, and much of the colony's history goes up in smoke. The archive must now be reconstructed, document by document. After the fire, Georges Barthélemy Faribault, a parliamentary clerk with a flair for history, accepts the enormous job of rebuilding the collection. His task takes him to Europe. In Paris, Faribault uncovers something astonishing: the first known portrait of Samuel de Champlain. It's a Canadian bombshell. Finally, after 200 years, the founding father has a face. And that face has an impact. Over time, a heroic image of Champlain takes root in the public imagination. It finds new life on stamps, banknotes, bottles of beer, even in ad campaigns.
Je vous dis, la Champlain Grand Prix, elle est bonne.
And yet, even though Champlain is everywhere, in a sense, he's really nowhere at all. In the thousands of pages he wrote, Champlain barely mentions his private life. His upbringing, marriage, and religion remain a mystery. We don't know his date of birth, and his grave can't be located because his remains have gone missing. And if you thought we knew what he looked like at least, think again. The portrait brought back from France was an elaborate fake.
They wanted a picture of Champlain, and they came up with one, and even when they knew it probably isn't what he really looked like, well, it was the only thing we had available.
What Faribault had actually found in Paris was a 17th century portrait of a little-known financial official. That man's face became Champlain's. Accomplices altered the engraving in several ingenious ways. They removed the skull cap and replaced it with hair, and the Italian garden with a view of Quebec. The engraving was signed Ducornet. The only problem is that Louis-Joseph Ducornet was not a contemporary of Champlain, but of Faribault, living in 1852. And Ducornet, born without arms, might have had trouble engraving with his feet.
And whether they actually took the picture of this man Particelli, who they knew was really someone else, and just said, well, we'll just steal that image, or whether somebody misidentified it, or whether they said, well, it's about the same time, he might have looked like that, we can't find a real picture, we'll just make a lithograph of this one, and that's what we'll do. I think people, it's part of being human. We have great imaginations, and where there's a void, we swim right into it. And, maybe we're all creating self-portraits.
It turns out everyone has their own portrait.
Very straight. I don't think he'd slouch. I think he was the way a confident person is. A person who feels that, here I am. And I can't see a person like that slouching around.
I see him as this very speedy guy, you know, with a very alert gaze, very sharp, pretty decisive, and he has that streak of ruthlessness, and he has that incredible ability to just take huge risks.
Long-standing mysteries attract dogged detectives, and some talented sleuths have dedicated themselves to filling in the picture of Samuel de Champlain, providing clues that help us look beyond the legend. We begin our investigations as the 1500s draw to a close in a busy French Atlantic port that Champlain himself claimed as his birthplace. During the late 16th century, one of the main gateways to the New World was Brouage, the birthplace of Samuel de Champlain. Once, the fortified city stood on the shores of the great Atlantic Ocean. But over time, the port silted up and the sea receded. Today, it lies 1 kilometer from the shore.
These are communities that are very open to seagoing trades and world trades. And the people knew enough about sailing and navigating that they really confidently believed they could go almost anywhere, not without some danger, but really. And so a young man growing up in Brouage, as Champlain seems to have done, would have been hearing stories of new adventures and strange peoples and new animals and new fruits and new products and all those kind of things.
Brouage and the surrounding region was a Protestant stronghold. It is likely that Champlain was born into a Protestant family.
The little we know about his father is that he was a pilot and a captain who sailed out of Brouage. But we don't know anything about his father and mother other than that.
He certainly had some education. Because we can see that he knew how to write quite well. He certainly learnt some drawing skills. He must have learnt some navigational skills at the same time.
There remains no trace of Champlain in Brouage. A fire destroyed all the parish records. The only independent claim that he was born there lies in a legal document signed by a dying uncle in Spain. A lot has been imagined since.
Je me suis intéressé aux dates pour voir si c'était.
I examined the dates to see if Champlain could be the son of Henry IV.
Être né à.
It's a little tight, but it's possible.
C'est juste, mais c'est possible. Ça pourrait arriver.
One unorthodox theory is that Champlain was the son of Henri de Navarre, later Henry IV of France. The future king recognized 11 illegitimate children. Could Champlain have been another?
On a beau avoir des noms de parents.
Even if the names of the parents are on the marriage certificate, it doesn't mean they didn't adopt him. But what is interesting with this theory is that Champlain was probably a nobleman. Someone protected him and provided him with an education, without leaving any traces.
1595. Champlain is now more or less 20 years old. We pick up his trail in 2 spots in Brittany, near the forest of Pimpon and near Compere Castle. Both places are featured in the legends of King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table. Henry IV, now King of France, has converted to Catholicism, and France has followed him. But it's not enough for some Catholic extremists in Brittany who declare war on the king. Champlain is fighting in the king's army. It is likely that he, too, has converted to Catholicism. Not far from Compere Castle, in the archives of the city of Rennes, is a payroll book for the king's army.
Alors Champlain dit ici fourrier.
It says fourrier. A fourrier is an officer who is responsible for lodging troops.
And certainly as a fourrier, he would have had to be very observant of detail and carry that around his head. the location of places, the mapping of streets and distance and so on and so on. Probably also he had to pay some attention to what resources were in the area.
In the same log, a little further, another entry, and even more surprising.
À Samuel de Champlain.
To Samuel de Champlain, the amount of 9 écus for secret voyages while in the king's service.
Wow.
We know from his very first pay record that he was making a voyage secret, for the service of his king. We don't really know what that was, but there's a second reference again in 1595 to a similar. We know he was working for Henry IV in an important way.
In 1598, Henry IV's victory ends 3 decades of religious war. Champlain heads to Port Louis to meet up with his uncle, a corsair named Guillaume Hélène.
I went to find my uncle, who was considered to be one of France's best seamen and who had been commissioned by the King of Spain as pilot general of their forces at sea.
With his uncle, Guillaume Hélène, Champlain heads for Spain. In the summer of 1598, they're in Cadiz, Spain's main Atlantic port. There, he joins a Spanish armada headed to the West Indies. But now he travels alone, without his uncle. What is he doing there? Who's paying his way? A journey veiled in mystery.
He's an intelligence officer, as I said. He's a spy and intelligence officer. He's working for Henry IV. That's clear from his early military career.
Champlain journeys through the Spanish New World, gathering information.
We know he was in the Spanish Caribbean for probably about 2 years and making himself of use to Henry IV while he was there. He's there at a very critical time. It's very much a Cold War. It really is. I mean, you really appreciate that at the time, the English, the French, the Dutch, the Spanish, all had their aspirations not only on profitable routes to the Orient, but owning and exploiting the New World.
He had the kind of physical toughness to throw off illnesses and throw off injuries and throw off hardships and go on at this very tough physically tough and mentally tough career that he was engaged in.
He doesn't fear the sea. He's made several dangerous crossings and he never seems to panic. The clumsiness of others sometimes makes him furious. And he's also a proud man.
By late 1601, Champlain is back in Paris at a crucial time. With peace at home, the king is eager to reassert his claim in the New World. Paris, 1601. Entrepreneur Pierre Dugas de Mont, who will loom large in Champlain's life, returns from his first voyage down the St. Lawrence. Dugas brings wonders from New France to enchant the king, including a moose. On the Seine, he shows off a birch bark canoe. Champlain arrives with his own report for the king. It is called A Brief Discourse of the Most Remarkable Things that Samuel Champlain of Brouage Reconnoitered in the West Indies. The king is intrigued. Champlain is put on the royal payroll. There are 3 known copies of the discourse, each different from the other, the most beautiful in a library in Providence, Rhode Island.
This is the cutting edge of knowledge. It's the frontier that has never been crossed, and Champlain is there and experiencing it for the first time. Bref Discours is filled with the most imaginative renderings of things that he's seeing, plant life that may or may not exist, animals that may or may not exist, creatures that definitely do not exist, but presented as if they do. And I don't know if that's humor or not, but it's certainly a vivid imagination.
Oddly, the 3 copies of the brief discourse that have been found are not only not identical, none of them is in Champlain's handwriting.
He gave a report of that voyage. He gave a verbal report to the king and his council. And it may be that the brief discours, well, it's a discourse, you know, it doesn't pretend to be a journal, that there was somebody sitting there making notes of what Champlain said. And that was later put together into some sort of story.
And there were other dramatic presentations at court. The merchant adventurer François Gravé Dupont introduces to the king two Montagnais and describes a river unlike any other.
They brought him back to the court, and they reported on the St. Lawrence, this huge waterway going into the interior, many islands and so on, and by canoe you can get pretty far.
Could this huge river be the western route to China? Champlain is asked to sail to New France to investigate. But he replies that before he can sail, he needs a special kind of permission from the king.
Champlain says, A, the king has given me a pension and expects me to be there, but B, he says, it's because also of the nature of my birth. What on earth does that mean? The nature of my birth seems to imply that he may be related to the king.
In the end, Champlain accepts the proposal and sets off for New France. In the spring of 1603, after a 71-day crossing, Samuel de Champlain, François Gravé Dupont, and the two Montagnais enter the St. Lawrence River and reach Tadoussac.
And Gravé Dupont is a key person. He's one of the merchants who's going back and forth from France. He's building up that kind of commercial relationship with the Montagnais and the other native people that he meets along the north shore of the Gulf of St. Lawrence.
With Gravé Dupont and native scouts, Champlain explores the territory and questions its inhabitants. Then he heads west, hoping to find the passage to China. But the Lachine Rapids stop him dead. Shortly after, Champlain is back in France. This time, he publishes the results of his investigation. The book is called Des Sauvages.
Before these Montagnais set out on the warpath, they all collected, with their rich fur garments adorned with...
He's very empirical and dry sometimes, but the interest for me is the native peoples, his observations.
And assembled in a large public square, where at their head was a saga.
What strikes me the most is how happy our native peoples were.
Attitudes with their bodies.
I mean, they were always dancing. And even when the men went off to war at the end of Des Sauvages, the women, they had this ritual of, well, they were always dropping their clothes.
The women stripped themselves stark naked, being decked with their...
They'd dance, and all of a sudden their robes would fall off, and they'd be totally naked. And they'd keep dancing.
And dancing got into their canoes, splashing a quantity of water over one another.
Scenes of hunting, scenes of war, scenes of people dancing are very important, very precious, and things that we would not know about if Champlain had not had this talent.
Having ended all these ceremonies, they withdrew into their lodges, and the natives went off to war.
He had his own preconceived ideas about the societies that he was interacting with, but still, a lot of the details there are very interesting ethnographically.
He traveled across the Atlantic dozens of times, going back and forth every year, suffered undoubtedly malnutrition. Throughout his North American experience, basically, he was never eating a proper diet.
Yeah, probably a good-looking guy. Yes, I believe he was a courageous man and a charismatic man also. Probably kind of alone, was maybe somebody who was solitaire.
Des Sauvages earns Champlain even more renown. In the spring of 1604, he is offered a second voyage. This time, he heads off with Pierre Dugas-de-Mont, who wants to set up a trading post in Acadia. But after 3 arduous years, the money runs out, and the men are forced to return to France. In spring 1608, the wharves of Honfleur are bustling as countless ships head out to sea. Here we pick up Champlain's trail again. On one of the walls of the harbor master's office, a discreetly placed bust. This is where merchants raised funds for costly expeditions to New France.
It's always about the dollars. It has to be. There has to be a return on this thing. I mean, they were, in the fur trade, they were borrowing money at rates of 25 to 30%. That was pretty routine. You know, it was an expensive way to do business, but it was a business.
Pierre Dugas-Dumont is hoping to set up a trading post on the St. Lawrence. But he doesn't make the trip. He hands the mission over to Champlain. In early July, Champlain sails up the St. Lawrence. This journey will rewrite the history of a continent. On July 3rd, 1608, he finds a nice flat stretch of shoreline overlooked by a cliff.
I looked for a proper place for our settlement, but I could not find any more suitable or better situated than the point of Quebec.
Champlain was asked to go to the Quebec area and pick a spot. And he wrote in his diaries, I could find no better one than the place where he built the habitation. So he was the contractor, if you wish. There was a grand architect. There was somebody who put up a lot of money for this and gave some advice. And then they hired a contractor to do it. That was Champlain.
It was a business deal in a tiny, harsh place, but it had the makings of a myth.
Initially, it's microscopically small. It certainly doesn't compare with the kind of trade the Spanish have in Mexico or in Peru, but it's still a complicated, elaborate, long-distance business.
Champlain quickly set about building his trading post and preparing for winter. But many of the men don't survive the brutal cold.
There's no real settlement, there's no real colony there. It's just an outpost, which is falling apart all the time because people don't have the right construction techniques.
By spring, Champlain heads inland with his native allies and begins to assess the territory's commercial potential.
The activity in Canada had to pay its own way. It's that commercial enterprise, it's the fisheries and the fur trade and the whaling that pay the rent for people like Champlain who begin map making and exploring and extending the trade.
In the following years, Champlain's expeditions move further inland. He gets beyond the Lachine Rapids the way the locals do, with a canoe, until the Great River opens up into the Great Lakes. He makes astute observations, takes precise notes, and draws accurate maps.
His maps were quantum leap over the maps that were there before him. In 1607, we have this magnificent hand-drawn chart by Champlain. It's a survey of the coast down to Cape Cod. All the other maps you see of Champlain's, there was an engraver that put them on paper. This is a manuscript map that shows best what the man could do. But Champlain I think he had a unique quality. He was extremely diligent about what he did. I think he was very, very diligent. He used what skills he had And he tried to always learn more.
He doesn't go to Lake Superior. He never sees Lake Erie. He never goes to Hudson's Bay. And yet he's able to fit all that in. There's that tremendous intellectual feat, too, of just integrating all that information and thinking about it geographically and putting it into a form that you could put down on a map.
So I see him as someone extremely comfortable, either in France or in the New World. And I hate to come up with false comparisons, but I think a little bit about an Ernest Hemingway figure who loves being in the wilderness, but he's always thinking about his next book also.
Well, I see him as probably someone who's pretty strong, pretty well built, probably not very big. And probably wiry, nervous, moving around a lot. Probably didn't sit down in one spot for very long.
Not content with a modest trading post, Champlain wants a colony full of settlers. For that, he needs money and connections. He gets both when he marries into an influential and wealthy family. His wife, Hélène, joins him in Quebec, but leaves after only 4 years. It will be a long-distance marriage with no children. Was it simply a good business deal? The archives in Paris show that Champlain built up an extensive network of trade alliances, all to guarantee the survival of Quebec. Hôtel de Soubise, in the heart of Paris, houses both the Royal Archives and the French Republic's most cherished documents. In the shadow of the facade, the palace's former stables now contain every notarial deed since the 16th century. Here is rich evidence of Champlain's maneuvers.
Et il signe un accord avec
This is an agreement to set up a trading company in New France.
en Nouvelle-France.
This deed grants him a salary of $25,000 a year and 1/20th of the profits from fur sales. Champlain is not simply an explorer. He's also an investor who wants to turn a profit.
Et là, c'est
And this, the incorporating document for the Company of Canada.
This deed guarantees him the sum of $30,000 a year and covers his travel costs. And in 1610, another commercial contract joins him in marriage to Hélène Boulet.
une avance douarée de 6 000 livres.
And this is an advance of 6,000 French pounds, of which 4,500 must be paid immediately.
4 500 livres.
The marriage means an inflow of $150,000. But for Champlain, it solves an even more pressing problem. In 1610, Henry IV is assassinated in the streets of Paris. The murder puts an end to Champlain's privileges at the royal court. But by marrying into the well-connected Boulet family, he secures his place among the elite.
La famille Boulet
The family was close to the king.
était
Nicholas, Hélène's father, was secretary to the king.
secrétaire du roi.
Now admitted to the court of Louis XIII, Champlain is ever more determined to expand the colony. So he writes 3 more books, propaganda aimed at selling his mission.
Every man instantly took down his lodge, and the Grand Captain was the first to begin to take his canoe and carry it to the water. He embarked his wife and children, and a quantity of furs.
I love the fact that he devoted so much time and energy to capturing what he saw in these books. I mean, many explorers saw a lot of these things and never wrote it down.
With the canoes of the
The 1632 edition is really a remarkable summary of all human knowledge relating to the New World. Plants, animals, the languages of the natives, how to sail, how to get there, how you should behave once you are there, what the water feels like. It's a really impressive display of human knowledge.
Yet Champlain's memories of the magnificence he has seen are strangely impersonal and unemotional.
At the end of the island, I saw a torrent of water falling from the top of a great mountain along the river of Canada. And on the top of the mountain,
Champlain records every detail about the land, but nothing about himself.
in the winter, when the snows are heavy, they make a kind of snowshoe twice or thrice as big as ours in France, which they fasten to their feet.
Il n'a pas écrit sur lui. He describes what's exterior to him, his surroundings.
Et du coup, c'est vrai que
So it's very hard to guess what his feelings were.
ses émotions. Il y a très très peu de vocables dans ces récits de voyage,
There are very few words that even evoke any kind of emotion.
même sensoriels. Il décrit.
He's simply describing, as in an encyclopedia.
Si on veut.
Friendly reader, having spent 38 years of my life in making many sea voyages, and been in many dangers and run many risks from which God has preserved me, and having all...
As Champlain writes those reflective words, his fortunes are falling. He's lost his fearless traveling companion, François Gravé-Dupont, and he's lost Quebec. Always ripe for the picking, the colony falls to the British in 1629. For 3 years, Champlain negotiates fiercely to get it back. In 1632, he succeeds and leaves for Quebec. He'll never again return to France.
On the 25th of December, the day of the birth of our Savior, Monsieur de Champlain was reborn in heaven.
On Christmas Day, 1635, Samuel de Champlain dies, surrounded by the Jesuits, who have become a guiding force in his life.
Those whom he left behind have reason to be well satisfied with him, for although he died out of France, his name will not be any less glorious to posterity.
The last evidence of Champlain in his own hand. The signature of a dying man who bequeaths half his property to the chapel of Notre-Dame de la Recouvrance in Quebec.
It is my wish, dear Lord, that the Holy Virgin Mary, your mother, be the heiress of all the possessions which I have here. And so I give to the chapel called Notre-Dame de la Recouvrance all that I...
Champlain left few personal traces, some deeds, a handful of signatures. In the end, his most lasting contribution may not have been the trading post at Quebec, but the maps and books that paved the way for colonization.
He saw his destiny here. He became single-minded about that. He was, by now, I think, emotionally attached to Canada. He was, I sort of consider him one of the earliest sort of patriots, somebody who loved the country.
In September 1898, a statue of Samuel de Champlain is erected on Dufferin Terrace in Quebec.
So he was the natural candidate. Here's a man, he's written about himself. We know something about him. He tells about his adventures. So let's make him a great founding father.
A young country, still short of mythic figures, was busy inventing them.
There was a movement starting in the mid 19th century to create a historiography of New France with a whole series of heroes, because they had been forgotten, pushed aside in many cases as well, following the fall of New France.
By 1908, Champlain's face is everywhere at Quebec's tercentennial celebrations.
to scrutinize Champlain or anybody else and say, let's not just hero worship. But at the same time, I think sometimes you have to concede that an individual really does have an important role in an event like the French colonization of New France.
His image still surveys what used to be New France. In St. John, New Brunswick, in random spots in the northeastern U.S., and in Ottawa's Nepean Point.
And I would argue, with all the debunking we can do, and all we need to say, well, he couldn't have done it without the merchants, and he couldn't have done it without his native allies, and he couldn't have done it without the church that came in, and he couldn't have done it without the support of the royal bureaucracy to some extent. He's still the one that's saying, hey guys, let's pull this thing together.
A very strong, determined man, but maybe a bit tragic, I'd say. I think there is a similarity between Kurtz in Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness and Champlain, because Kurtz totally loses himself in Africa. For Champlain, it's similar. More and more, he loses all his attachments in France.
His movements are not abrupt.
Quelqu'un de silencieux.
He's the silent type who writes with conviction.
A, je pense, beaucoup plus de force de conviction.
Rather than someone who talks too much and writes little.
Et qui écrit peu.
Quebec, 1640. The final mystery begins, as did the first, with a fire. Champlain's body has been interred for 5 years in the governor's chapel. The building is now ablaze. The young colony's history is in danger of disappearing. Miraculously, the coffin is recovered intact and moved to a safe place. And there, the story should end. But that safe place was so safe that we're still looking for it. At times, rather too enthusiastically.
There have been many, many discoveries of Champlain's tomb. Yes, I think it has been found perhaps 10 times, and I think there are over 20. I know that there are over 20 hypotheses of where it may be.
For 150 years, no effort has been spared to find the tomb. Ancient plans and documents have been examined and decoded. Searchers have dug day and night and drilled through foundations.
C'est terminé. Il n'y a rien en dessous.
But what happened was they went into the basement of a Chinese restaurant. That's probably not inappropriate because Champlain himself was looking for China, so...
The cause has attracted both the serious and the strange.
Another fellow, working with Bouchard d'Orval, I believe, used a plumb bob. But he was walking with a plumb bob, and that was supposed to show where Champlain's tomb was.
The man claimed to receive images through his pendulum and was convinced he'd cleared up the mystery.
The drawings provide a true account of events, and their precision has allowed for very clear conclusions.
The body's location remains a great Canadian mystery. Even after death, the man of many secrets has one more to keep.
I think people want to know more about him. That's what the question boils down to. Because of what he did, because he did found the city of Quebec, because he did discover many things on the coast of North America, in the heart of North America as well, in the Great Lakes Basin. Well, I think that makes him what we would now call a public figure, and people want to know much more about the public figures.
And so we keep looking for clues about Champlain. Nearly 400 years later, a team of Parks Canada archaeologists carries out excavations at Fort St. Louis. The original fort dates back to 1620, when Champlain chose the strategic summit of Cap au Diamant to settle.
It's our history. If you go back to 1620, when the first Fort St. Louis was built, that was a mere 12 years after Champlain founded Quebec. The population was minimal, a few dozen people. And we can go back that far. Our discoveries at this site also give us an idea of how the country was born and how it developed.
While examining plans of Fort St. Louis dating from 1635 and 1640, the Parks Canada archaeologists discovered a staircase and a cannon platform. They also discovered Champlain's residence.
These are the stones of his quarters, where he lived and likely died too. This would be the southeast corner. The remnants you see here form the cornerstone of the foundation. That's all that's left.
The site was well chosen, and it's very well built. This proves that Champlain was a man who thought things out carefully. He was also a knowledgeable man. He knew cartography and he knew topography. That's why he chose to build here.
Here, in the end, is some of the most tangible evidence of the life of a colony. The raw material of the extraordinary people who settled here. But the thoughts of the man who founded Quebec remain elusive. If Champlain had any idea of what he had accomplished, he kept it to himself.
It's curious, it provokes curiosity. How could he actually live all of those experiences? What did he think when he was founding Quebec, when he was founding New France as well? Did he realize he was actually founding New France, or was he just more tied into day-to-day activities of building his habitation and building the Fort St. Louis? We will never know. But we know that he founded the city of Quebec. We know that Quebec became and is still considered as the cradle of New France and was a very important trading post, city, cultural center through time. We know that happened. We know that Champlain founded it, but we will never really know what he thought, I don't think.